Nothing ever happens. A popular meme on the internet right now, and unfortunately, the largest critique that people have of the first published Kaiserreich continuation, Kalterkrieg. The mod was so much promise, a Kaiserreich sequel, with many developers who had eventually become Kaiserreich developers themselves ended up disappointing many with its content, lore, lack of conflict, or glazing of liberalism. As a former developer, seeing this discourse and playing it myself has me disappointed. While I understand why people have these critiques, many of these critiques are either unattainable or just disrespectful. In this video, I hope to highlight the strengths of the scenario, address the weaknesses, and explain through my experience as a game designer, propose some potential fixes to cover the weaknesses without compromising the identity of the mod or the work that has already been put into it. First things first, is the critique of nothing ever happening in Kalterkrieg valid? Well, yes and no. In video games, player agency is a very important factor. Vanilla Hearts of Iron 4 is a sandbox game where you can justify wars on anybody as soon as you want. And through the world tension and faction system, there's always going to be a big war that encompasses the entire world, for better and for worse, especially for worse if you're playing non-historical. Enter Kaiserreich, an alternate history with a guaranteed world war with different factions, geopolitical realities, ideologies, and more. Kaiserreich was so good that it inspired many to make continuations of their timeline. In this case, Kalterkrieg takes an interesting look at an Entente versus Reichspact Cold War, and unfortunately, despite the insane amount of work that had gone into every nation, many had complained that nothing ever happened. Critics who point out the absence of direct conflicts are often dismissed with the explanation that this was only an alpha release, and while it may be true that it didn't have depth for every major nation of the world, it's still a valid critique. While new proxy conflicts are currently in development, simply adding new civil wars or balancing the other civil wars may not be enough to combat the main issues, and unfortunately, many of the issues lie in its scenario. I covered this in a little more detail on my Krosnacht Loregrave video, but the reason why it feels like nothing ever happens is that it's a semi-railroaded Cold War scenario in a World War II sandbox game. It also doesn't help that if a third Weltkrieg started on day 1, or even later into the scenario, like it's currently designed, the outcome is 90% in favor of a Reichspact victory, and while Vanilla Hearts of Iron 4 and Kaiserreich are designed around getting your nation set up for war in 3 to 4 years, with several different opportunities to influence the outbreak and the factions of the coming war, Kalterkrieg, as it is currently, does not provide enough opportunities for each international bloc to fight each other, directly or indirectly, before the climax of a third Weltkrieg that may or may not happen. Thankfully, the Kalterkrieg team has already begun to address these critiques. While there's already a game rule to always allow the canonical escalation of the conflict to become a third Weltkrieg, which by default is set to off, they're introducing a world tension-like system in order to ensure that a world war begins in an organic way. As the player, you can make decisions which allow you to guarantee or prevent a third Weltkrieg, and instead focus on exploring the stories of the main powers. However, we're once again stuck in an awkward position, where in order to properly explore these situations, we need to rely on a lot of custom-made, modded content to add in gameplay features that make peacetime gameplay worth playing. With that in mind, we need to take an approach which respects the lore and work that has already been put into place. Unlike my Loregrave videos, where I can take the core concept of a mod and represent it with my own view on things, this mod is very much alive, and any suggestions that I may be presenting to the team may be received negatively. I say this with my Loregrave videos, but is even more relevant now. My ideas and suggestions are not to be taken as gospel. Whether or not these suggestions are incorporated or are rejected are 100% up to the development team. My hope is that these suggestions are seen as honest attempts to help address often repeated critiques. It is not seen as a negative critique in and of itself. Also, keep in mind that I may accidentally misrepresent the mod in what is currently implemented in game. If I do make any major errors, I'll be sure to address them in a pinned comment in this video. Without further ado, the LoreDoc is in. Usually at this point in a Loregrave video, I would present the core of the scenario to build up from. And while there's already a core, there's a whole body and a whole mod already constructed. The goal of this video is not to reinvent Kalterkrieg. If I wanted to do that, I would just make my own canon Kaiserreich Cold War scenario video. Instead, we need to simultaneously look at each part of the scenario while also keeping in mind the core. Kalterkrieg is a Reichspact versus Entente Cold War, but it's far more than that. It's a story of two factions that are split between looking to the past and looking to the future. As the nuclear age dawns on the world of Kaiserreich, the two reactionary factions which had destroyed the Third Internationale have either been adapted or been repressed by the victorious Entente and Reichspakt respectively. While the Reichspakt is adamant in restoring and ensuring German dominion over the world, their foreign policy will need to adapt to the flexible Entente as they rebrand to the Accord and use their agile and forward-thinking foreign policy to prevent the Kaiserreich from becoming a Weltreich. In this regard, the Kalterkrieg developers have done a good job exploring these themes, but while Kalterkrieg has done an excellent job in world building and addressing the issues of the scenario, in gameplay and lore, I believe that the current focus on realism, and being a direct continuation of Kaiserreich, is holding the developers back from creating their own beautiful world. The problem with making yourself a direct Kaiserreich continuation mod is that the proper lore for a nation and the debates that people can have about the plausibility of a certain outcome can be extremely different from one another. Even worse, the nation you're trying to develop gets reworked. The entire foundation that you're building on needs to be scrapped and restarted. Kalterkrieg is lucky that the American Civil War facelift only changed minor lore elements and the name of their factions. What if the whole thing was reworked? Herein lies my first suggestion. Do not be a Kaiserreich continuation, or if you are, freeze your lore to suit a particular version of the mod before proceeding. This is simultaneously the least and most radical suggestion of many, because when you freeze your continuation point, your point of divergence, if you will, to a specific point in time, it will simultaneously allow for the Kalterkrieg developers to, say, restore the old names of the American tags, and not be held back by pending reworks to introduce new conflicts into the scenario. However, it would also throw out all the work that the development team had put into conforming to Kaiserreich. However, the mod has been released, the feedback has been received, and it might be time to reconsider this approach. Regardless of the direction that the Kalterkrieg developers take, either continuing their current ambitions of being a direct continuation, or freezing their lore to the latest version and moving forward, in my video I'll be taking an approach which is pinned to the current version, without the fear it'll need to be changed when the Kaiserreich developers cook again. I hope that you and the Kalterkrieg developers can see the merits of this approach, as the further we go down the rabbit hole, the more exciting it becomes. While we could just say that we're going to be changing the point of divergence to be way back in time instead of being a direct Kaiserreich continuation, we still need to redefine our core while simultaneously respecting Kalterkriegs. A long time, a friend of mine pointed out that Kalterkrieg is the TNO ending of Kaiserreich. This person's a radical socialist, so obviously they feel that way, but it's completely true. Decolonization, the civil rights movement, and many other defining factors of progress were certainly adopted by the West when facing the communists as a means to avoid the USSR and their allies from exploiting these social issues to advance their cause. In Kalterkrieg, there is no major force for progressive change. Due to the hardcore conservatism of Germany and the rift that forms between the Reichspakt and the Accord, liberalism would naturally begin to adopt these progressive ideas, becoming more social liberal and appropriate the syndicalist ideology naturally. With this in mind, we're going to take an approach where, instead of attempting to accentuate the ideological divides between the two major factions, we will instead focus on the new core, Victorian-era politics, but with nukes. The dominant position that Germany has against the Accord lets them define the terms of their Cold War, but after the USA is reunited, the German colonial empire collapses, and the Accord expands its membership and economic unions alike. The tables begin to shift, and a world of mutually assured destruction is born, entering the period of the Cold War that we all know and love. I've seen some people suggest that this scenario would be more balanced at the start if the United States was fully united under a liberal, who would then lead the Entente. However, this isn't Kalterkrieg, and such a large reform would undo 4 different tags worth of work, which is unacceptable. That being said, I do have some radical changes that I'd like to propose, but to ease into things, I'm going to start with the easiest, low-effort adjustments possible and gradually increase the wackiness. Without further ado, let's get started. Many people have said that one of the things that would help the scenario out the most is the redesign of Russia. I've seen people advocate for the expansion in Russian holdings far beyond what they currently control. However, there are a lot of things wrong with this approach. For one, Germany would not just focus all their attention on France to capitulate them at the expense of the Russians potentially getting within bombing distance of Berlin. And if the Russians gained more land, I can only see it realistically happening if they take Kiev, but even if they did, the Belgrade Pact would join the conflict. Currently, in Kalterkrieg, they stayed neutral, and in order to avoid reworking the entire Balkan situation, we'll be preventing this from occurring. Therefore, I suggest that the Russo-Reichspakt border remain the same. Russia is currently designed so Savinkov's regime dissolves and is replaced by moderates who don't want to engage in a conflict with the Germans. I feel like this is the biggest weakness of the mod currently, and why it cannot be fixed by making the scenario more focused on warfare without proper planning. There should be no surprise that the Reichspakt would demolish the Accord in open conflict when they don't even need to worry about the Eastern Front. And even if they do, Russia is exhausted, weakened, not nuclear capable, and has no sympathy from the Liberal Accord, making it so they have to manage their own front line completely by themselves. What I propose is simple. Have Savinkov or his successor work together with the Accord in a enemy of my enemy is my friend way, and grant the Russians more arms and a nuke or two for good measure. The idea that Savinkov or the Accord would seriously consider working with the national populists is certainly alarming to consider. However, I feel like this is the only move that the Accord could make, and falls directly in line with the foreign policy that had led to World War I anyway, so it's not implausible. An easy ideological solution to the problem is to have Russia become a democracy under a liberal faction. However, a liberal Russia, being second fiddle to the Entente, seems like far too much of a buff to the Entente to be reasonable. There's also the fact that a Russian alliance with the Accord may cause the Danubian Federation to stay together with Germany no matter what, which would go against my second suggestion, have Danubia and Germany already split by the start date. Hey, thanks for watching the video so far. If you're enjoying my content, please consider subscribing. Subscribing really helps the channel grow, so thank you very much for your consideration. Germany and the Austrians continuing to be allies after fighting 2 world wars together seems like a perfectly reasonable assumption given the historical precedent. However, this alignment ensures German victory in any direct conflict. What I propose is that at the start of this game, Austria has already left the Reichspakt and is actively attempting to establish their own sphere of influence through neutrality and isolationism. The Danubian geopolitical strategy would be to play nicely with both sides of the conflict in order to properly stabilize their country following their reforms. The federalization of the Austro-Hungarian Empire would have significantly improved the stability of the region, but there would be several factions within their state who would be fighting for independence, especially due to the fact that Serbia and Romania both have not given up their ambitions to liberate their countrymen. By altering the relationship between Germany and the Danubian Federation, we've set the stage for what could be another major escalation that could lead to a third Weltkrieg. A Yugoslavian-style collapse on steroids. Now, this is quite the radical decision to make, and could arguably be implausible. If the Austrians knew that by distancing themselves with Germany, they would be liable to collapse, why would they ever? Well, I believe that Germany is so authoritarian in nature, and the Danubians were only able to keep their empire by reforming it to be a democratic federative model. The fact that they're still associated with Germany could be viewed by the local minority governments as proof that they were still German-centric rather than Danubian-centric. While it's really easy to say, just make this country have a civil war, so the Reichspakt and the Accord can send volunteers to either side, it's a lot more difficult to discuss exactly what either side would gain from this dynamic. I think the easiest way to facilitate this conflict is by changing the foreign policy of the German Empire to always desire to dismantle the Danubian experiment before liberalism erodes the natural order of the German Empire. Thus, they would attempt to form a greater Germany by supporting German secessionists, annexing Austria into Germany. Following this collapse, they would divide the remaining territories claimed by Poland, Ukraine, and support either a greater Hungarian secessionist state or a more tame one, like the current dissolution that Kaiserreich resembles. Regardless of how much either Germany or Hungary claims, German control over Central Europe would be guaranteed. If done covertly, the expansionist ambitions of the Germans could simply be designated as a natural consequence of liberalism, rather than a deliberate cannibalization of their former ally. This seems like far too much of an ask already, but thankfully, we can use the elements which had already been designated to Danubian gameplay in this dynamic. The already established minigames of the Danubian Federation to influence local politics can be used to allow for the player to potentially keep the Danubian political situation stable, allowing for them to continue on to the next phase of gameplay, either as friend or foe. But if the player fails the minigame, especially due to foreign interference, the Danubian Federation would face a violent collapse, which could easily escalate into an indirect or direct conflict between the Reichspakt and Accord. Again, it's really easy to say, and then Germany grobes Deutschland über alles. But by doing so, we're simultaneously dictating the ultimate demise of the Danubian Federation, or becoming a direct ally of the Accord, and dictating what German foreign policy should be at the expense of the already established and designed content for Germany. I've been racking my head to find a way to preserve the Danubian content without dictating the foreign policy of Germany, like making German policy towards Danubia be a path dictated by them, which can be enabled or disabled by determining AI paths. However, in my opinion, all solutions point towards Germany needing to be a villain. Currently, the German Empire and its lore is focused around their attempts to learn from the mistakes of their previous governance, which had led to the Internationale gaining so much land in collaboration from the local workers' unions. All the actions that Germany takes towards their internal policies, their colonial policies, and foreign policies are all completely rational decisions, which ensure the German Empire does not face a conflict that it's not ready for, and allows for the Germans to become extremely dominant in the world without facing much struggle. But by focusing on the diplomatic actions that the Germans should take, we're ignoring the diplomatic actions the Germans would actually make. The Germans aren't a democratic, forward-thinking state. Ever since Bismarck's appointment in Prussia, they have not been defeated in any open conflict, even when several rival nations banded together against them twice in wars that encompass the entire world. They have been victorious, and now they're attempting to ensure that their rivals who have continuously attempted to keep Germany weak are never able to rise up against them again. I can understand why the KRG team is taking this approach. If Germany ends up acting aggressive and domineering, or attempts to claim lands with German speakers as a means to expand, they wouldn't be acting much differently than the German fashionistas of our history, and would therefore be compromising the character of the German Empire. However, I would push back on this. The ideas that the German fashionistas had eventually come up with were not made in a vacuum. The policies enacted by them during their march eastwards was a natural continuation of the foreign policy of the German Empire in World War I. Instead of creating a bunch of puppet governments, they would just rule the lands directly. The German Empire even tried colonizing the Baltic, with the remnants of their colonization attempts still persisting in Kalterkrieg. To summarize, I believe Germany should be far more proactive of a power than it currently is, including becoming a villain, if that helps put people in the right mindset to imagine their foreign policy. With this villain aspect in mind, I'd like to suggest reintroducing something from the Chroma era. National Populist Switzerland. Back in the Chroma era, the lore for Switzerland followed the National Populist Kaiserreich path, where the entirety of the French-speaking cantons had fallen to the French syndicalists, and the Swiss were not protected by any of their neighbors. The National Populists under Hans Brandt would reform Switzerland from a democratic federation to a unitary nationalist state. Once the Second Weltkrieg had begun, the Swiss would work together with the Reichspakt and Entente to defeat the Third Internationale. Once the Commune of France capitulated, the Swiss had managed to regain their former territories. However, in initial design, the Swiss would have also occupied all of Savoy, using nationalist claims as a reason to garrison the area. Due to the Swiss government and their resentment towards Germany and Austria for refusing to aid them against the French initially, the Swiss would maintain a twisted form of neutrality and become isolated from the rest of the world. What I feel like would be a really interesting conflict for South France to manage in the mainland would be to attempt to liberate the French-speaking populace from oppression in this Swiss state. This could start as a simple revolution supported by volunteers, but it could escalate towards the Accord seeking to utterly destroy the national populist Swiss government and restore their democratic government. Perhaps this revived Switzerland doesn't even need to be neutral and could become a direct member of the Accord. The Germans would realize this risk. Therefore, in order to prevent a new flank from being exposed in this Cold War, they would need to act. There are three choices they can make. The first, most reasonable option would be to support the claims of the South French in exchange for guaranteeing that Switzerland remains neutral. But since this prevents an actual conflict from occurring between the two major powers, I'm going to eliminate this option, leaving only two. Germany could either invade Switzerland to ensure their alignment to the Reichspakt, or covertly support the Swiss government with weaponry to ensure their victory in the conflict. Maybe a nuke or two accidentally crossed the border, who knows. Eventually, this proxy war would need to die down. The Swiss are able to suppress the French separatists, then it's up to the Accord to consider direct intervention against the Swiss. However, at that point, they may already be guaranteed by the Reichspakt. In order to prevent a direct conflict between the major powers, the proposal of restoring a neutral Switzerland may cause Germany to instead attack Switzerland, especially if the Accord is beginning to occupy German-speaking cantons. The resulting occupations of the pre-war Swiss mainland could result in several different outcomes. If the Reichspakt and Accord both occupy areas of the mainland, they could either set up rival puppet governments, or agree to restore a neutral Switzerland. If either faction wins utterly, the potential for a non-neutral Switzerland to be integrated into their faction is possible. But in the case of the Germans, the possibility for them to simply partition Switzerland between the German and French-speaking regions to themselves and their puppet French government is certainly on the table. I hope that this general outline excites you as much as it does for me. Thankfully, this concept is relatively simple to implement, given how it's focused on one nation and their neighbors. So this could pretty easily become a submod if anybody outside of the KRG dev team wants to give this a shot. On the topic of making Germany act more villainous, why don't we take a look at the colonial empire and its current unfortunate demise? As far as I understand, the collapse of Middle Africa is an inevitability, despite the Germany player having a focus which allows for them to determine their leader, and therefore the outcome of the collapse somewhat. There's no other agency for the Germany player to the outcome of their own colony. While I was definitely a supporter of this approach while I was on the development team, for plausibility and balance reasons, I think that the Middle Africa collapse needs to be violent. Extremely violent. There's currently only one proxy conflict that's guaranteed post-collapse, that being the Congolese Federation versus the Katangan separatists. There's a clear issue at hand, and it's not as easy as just changing lore to suit a violent collapse. Changing the design without thinking could throw out all the content that's already been established for the nation. That, and the faction of the separatist tags need to be heavily researched in order to properly convey the history of the largest continent in the world. But it could really be as easy as making a change where the new path is established. One could be the rational neo-colonial decision by pragmatic capitalists, while the other could double down to go total war over their place in the sun, refusing to give an inch to any separatists and ensure that the German colonial empire remains untouched. And if that sounds ridiculous or implausible, you're forgetting that the USA had committed an entire generation of men to fighting communists in the jungles of Vietnam. While this wasn't a war to ensure that the French colonial empire persisted, and was more following the containment doctrine of the United States against communism, this isn't the United States containing communism, it's the hard-headed Germans fighting to preserve their empire, something that they had been tirelessly doing for the last 40 years. Why wouldn't the Germans take the same actions that the Americans had in Vietnam in this history? While I wish I could have more constructive feedback than which is essentially just a complaint, I wanted to bring this up to at least help start a conversation about reconsidering German foreign and domestic policy in favor of violent conflict. But enough about Germany, let's start talking about Canada. Back when Kalterkrieg first released, a guy from college made a video that really criticized Kalterkrieg and really hurt a lot of people's feelings. A lot of his critiques were valid, and this is one of them.
Next in the news, the North American Trade Organization forms as a way to isolate the American Union state economically, and I really just don't get the logic here. Canada is deliberately antagonizing a nation that should be able to kill them straight up in a war. It feels like a super nationalistic Canadian wrote this whole region with how powerful they think that country is, because it really doesn't make sense why it's 1948 and the longest haven't united the country.
I admit that this is a very choice critique. I myself feel responsible for this since I was heavily involved in Canada's development. In my defense, I was granted a task: make a Canada versus Germany Cold War viable, and thus I tried giving Canada every advantage that I could. At first glance, the premise of twice successful German Empire versus former colony the British seems like a non-starter, but it ignores the points of divergence that had led to the rise of Canada in Kaiserreich and Kalterkrieg. And they're all on the screen here, I can't go into too much detail, it'll take too long. However, despite all these advantages, Canada would be limited by their geography. While Canada is one of the largest countries in the world, a significant majority of their land is mostly unsuited for human inhabitation. While the idea of a significant measure to ensure the urbanization of more northern cities through the development of a resource extraction economy is really compelling, this may be ranking Canada too much. I propose that in order to make the antagonist of this battle more relevant against Germany, that there be a shift towards an Imperial Federation, or CANZUK, that in the early years of gameplay is politically centered in Canada. This addresses the Canada will never be a superpower issue due to the fact that they would be able to integrate the Australasian and British economies into their dominion. It enables future expansion options through reclaiming old imperial crowns like South Africa, and properly contextualizes the Canadians as the imperial holdout that they've been for decades. This sounds like a really large ask. However, I believe that if designed properly, it could be implemented without overriding the development efforts that have gone into these three tags. If Canada starts off still focused on being the new center of the British Empire, the political reforms that Mackenzie King enacts all on day one would instead be a struggle for reform against the entrenched elite and imperial identity. The player would need to strike a balance between embracing liberal values and reforms within the empire while keeping the identity of the empire intact. moving towards the modern era. This could be accomplished by granting the Canada tag more means to support the British and Australasian tags. Maybe even a shared focus tree between these three nations could lead to an eventual uniting of the tags in their entirety. However, if this is the only path forward for the Imperial tags, then this would mean a lot of deleted work. Since we want to prevent that, I think that we should give the player the decision to dictate the future of the British Empire. Perhaps the reforms to help unite the Empire are instead mellowed out to be more of a union of nations, which can be applied to other members of the Accord, rather than an Imperial-focused project. If designed properly, this mechanic could be applied to the already existing Accord election mechanics, and more. This is one of the bigger asks, because integrating this change effectively without causing conflicts with the designs of the British and Australasian tags would be tricky to pull off. I believe that this would kill two birds with one stone. It would keep the identity of the Germany versus Canada Cold War, fix balance concerns between the two primary fighters, and preserve our core of Victorian foreign policy with nukes, without deleting too much work. Currently, the lore for Russia is that they agreed to a ceasefire with Germany a year before the start date. I feel like this isn't particularly a bright decision by the Russians. While Russia may be exhausted from the conflict and needs time to reconstitute itself, Germany has far more potential to bounce back and destroy Russia. Therefore, I believe that it would be a good idea to consider them giving a real reason why they had to. With the Russia Rework finally being completed, we have a better understanding of what would have led to this sort of outcome. If the Eastern Uprising under Semyonov would have been successful enough, the potential of Russia actually losing Siberia would give them a practical reason to stop fighting Germany. If timed properly, this ceasefire may even be a delicate peace. Germany would be able to focus more of their manpower against the syndicalists, which would have allowed them to finally defeat them, but at the cost of straining their relationships with their eastern satellite states. Or a more significant lore revision may be that the Germans would be joining a grand coalition against the co-prosperity sphere. We'll look into this later, but regardless of whether this is a major or minor lore revision, it would still require a lot of localization to be adjusted to suit the new lore, and the entire Asian dynamic would need to be revised, which is why I'm putting this so far down on the list. The current China outline could potentially not need much revision. A united front between the Federalists and the Beiyang government could work with the Russians to expel the Japanese out of mainland Asia. But if the successors Savinkov are the Eurasianists, and the Russians had supported Mongolian and East Turkestani separatists, the Russians could seek to integrate these two regions claimed by China while also claiming Manchuria along Eurasian lines. If we do go down this path, there would be significant tension between themselves and the Accord. The Accord would want Russia to be strong as a counterweight to Germany, but the disapproval that the Federalists would have towards the Accord for their lack of outrage could lead to them not joining their alliance. This level of conflict between Russia and China may lead Germany to feel confident in breaking off the Eastern Peace Deal, which could lead to a war. Overall, a very compelling and exciting incident which enables the player to engage in more conflicts. But why would Germany ever want to work with the Russians against the Japanese? Well, what if, by doing so, the Germans are able to restore their East Asian colonies? With the German-Russian ceasefire and the extended period of time of the World War's duration, it could be that the Entente, Moscow Accord, and Reichspakt all had an agreement to dismantle the Japanese Empire. This seems like a radical change, but as it is currently, Asia has no content besides the China War, and if we are really deciding to go down the path of Victorian politics with nukes, what could be more fitting than the Europeans all banding together to partition an entire continent? And while this does open up the opportunity for Japan to be split down the middle Cold War style, I think that it makes more sense for the regions of Japan itself to be a neutral, demilitarized state. Maybe Hokkaido becomes a Russian territory though, because of course they would. We could also do something funny with Korea by making them national revivalist republicans with an ideology similar to Duce, but they could also be a wholesome republic. Maybe there's a civil war. A Korean War, perhaps? While Japan itself may not be open to becoming a new battleground for the Cold War, the re-establishment of the German East Asian and Dutch East Asian colonies grants an entire new region for the Accord to meddle in decolonization-wise. But maybe this could be the ambition of a socialist India, who becomes the last bastion of socialism in the world. But by this point, we're far beyond the core of Kalterkreig. As it is now, the co-prosperity sphere could end up being an interesting third power in this conflict. Maybe the Japanese and their faction could be swayed to join either the other two factions with enough diplomatic and economic investment, similar to how Italy can be swayed to join the OFN or the sphere in the New Order, if that's even going to stay in the game. Regardless of how Southeast Asia turns out, I felt like it was important to take a quick look at it to be thorough. Well, that's certainly a long video. Definitely longer than my Krasnach one. I could have split this into two parts, but I felt like since I was a former developer, I would be able to give a lot more insight, just because I'm so familiar with their lore already. I'd like to say for a third time, the Kalterkrieg development team is under no obligation to implement these things. If they do want to implement these things, maybe you can join their team and implement it yourself. If they don't want to implement these things, maybe you can make a submod. The outcome of this is out of my hands, and while I support Kalterkrieg or any other submods, I'll be taking a step back to let things resolve the way that they should. Anyway, I was really passionate about this, and I hope you could tell in my voiceover and the amount of effort I put into this video. If you could give a like and a comment and subscribe, that would be a huge help in boosting the channel. With that being said, it's your LoreDad. Stay safe, don't take candy from strangers, listen to critiques, and I hope you have a good day.